but I will be happy to entertain questions when I'm done. I prefer to take them at the end if that's all right with everyone. Otherwise, we tend to lose the thread a little bit as we're going through. So we'll go through. I'll go through fairly quickly. It's a little bit longish, so we'll make sure that we get it all in here. Notice the title. We are somewhere in Ontario. Okay. And we're standing rather flabbergasted, I would think, in that somewhere, that place that we're not going to name. The Nazi soldiers going down our street. Now, what can that possibly be about if we're in Ontario? I mean, how can we possibly have Nazi soldiers going down the street? I'm unable to tell you the location that they're in or where we are right now, because of course the government has said that there will be complete silence about the location of prisoner of war camps in Canada and in Ontario. And there will never be any photographs taken that indicate where prisoner of war camp. Sure recognize the corner at all. However, let's just see as we go along. Britain and Canada both declared war within the first 10 days of September of 1939. Following that declaration of war, and that's because Germany had done some taking over of land and so on, and countries. So in actual fact, by that time, by 1939, we already knew what might be ahead of us. Very quickly after we did declare war, both Great Britain and Canada, all those countries began to fall, and they just fell in quick succession. Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, France. And it was learned very quickly that the Fuhrer had other plans as well. He had plans, which we all eventually found out about, called Operation Sea Lion, a plan for the invasion of Britain. And it was that plan that sparked what you're going to be learning about today. Prisoners of war were starting to become a problem for Britain. Britain actually won the Battle of the Air and the Battle of the Water very quickly in the early days of the war. And as a result of both of those, there were all kinds of prisoners starting to be amassed in England. And you have a whole lot of German prisoners in England, because as soon as the chance happened that they were able to cross that little tiny channel into Great Britain, they would have had a ready-made army waiting in prisoner of war camps that they could just unlock, let out, and you'd have another whole piece of an invasion army right there in Britain already there. So they knew they had to get rid of them. The other thing was they couldn't afford to feed them. Food was going to become scarce at the very least. So they had to get rid of the prisoner of war camps and people that they had in England. And where were they going to put them? Well, Canada agreed to take many of them. And in fact, on the 10th of June, 1940, Gravenhurst, which had been scouted out among many other towns and communities across Canada, Gravenhurst got told, you know, the Camp Calidore that's been sitting for 5 years, that tuberculosis sanatorium that's been sitting vacant, that one right there. Well, we're going to put a whole lot of Nazi P.O.W. into that building. So we want you to get it ready for 400 plus prisoners of war in 20 days. It does sound like a government, doesn't it? It sounds like many governments that we know. And in actual fact, where that little map there, you can see Muskoka Bay, you can see then the shoreline there, you can see Rigaud Lake is there. That little red square there is where this Calidore Sanatorium was. It's not the one that was out on the point. It's not the one that was the college. This is the third sanatorium. Actually, we had 4 in Gravenhurst for the treatment of tuberculosis. We had the first sanatorium in Canada, 1897. We had the first free hospital for the treatment of tuberculosis in 1902 in Gravenhurst. And then we had 2 more. One of them was Calidore, And Calidor was meant for the well-to-do patient, TB patient, who could afford to pay for room and board at a significant rate. So in actual fact, it had been sitting empty for 5 years because TB was pretty much on the wane, and the depression, people couldn't afford to pay big fees. So as a result, with its pink roof, sitting empty. The government wasn't long to find that it was there. How do you change a 25-year-old sanatorium into a POW camp in 10 days or 15 days? Not easily. So we had all kinds of Royal Canadian Engineer people here, and they were in fact going to be the people who, along about 186 tradesmen in Gravenhurst, were going to turn rather old sanatorium into a POW camp. And you can see these shots all show you what it looked like when it was in its early days. This is a guard tower just under construction. You've got guards and tents. You've got a 10-foot high steel fence with barbed wire curving in. That's been built. That's the first thing. And then after that, everything else.
How does that work?
Got a lot of construction underway, and you're getting these guys whether it's ready or not.
I have Zoom to listen to this.
POW camp was pretty obviously not going to be a fun thing to be doing. It must have been clear what a nightmare it would be, because not only were you going to be in charge of 400 plus, as it turned out, closer to 500 POWs, but you also were going to have to be in charge of the veterans guards who were going to be guarding them, quote unquote, unarmed as they were. You were going to be in charge of all the staff who were going to have to cook for them. We're going to have to clean. Eventually, the German POWs, in fact, had their own people doing all of that, but we'll talk about that in a moment. And if that wasn't bad enough, you had people looking over your shoulder all the time, trying to tell you what you should be doing and how you should be doing it. So in fact, Geneva Convention of 1929, which outlined how you were going to treat prisoners. But on top of that, you had protecting power called Switzerland, who would ensure that you were following the Geneva Conventions. You had the International Committee of the Red Cross following, and the War Prisoners Aid of the International YMCA, which doesn't sound very powerful, but it was. At that time, it was a very powerful organization. So you've got a lot of people over the shoulder of the camp commandant saying, oh, no, that's not appropriate. No, I'm sorry, you can't do that, and so on. It would not have been fun. The commanding officer not only all the POWs, but he had the Veterans Guard of Canada. And he would have 200 of them at a time, and they would be there for about 2 months. They would go on R&R for about 2 months, and then they would be moved to another camp. They didn't want to foster any relationships between POWs and guards. So in fact, you kept them kind of mobile, you kept them moving. And we had 25 POW camps eventually in Canada. So in fact, there were lots of places to move them to. All the guard duties then were going to be maintained by the Veterans Guard. You had one company at a time, 4 platoons, 211 guards. They'd be there for 2 months, then they'd be gone for R&R, then they go to the next camp. It was a smoothly oiled machine. There's the recruiting poster for the Veterans Guard. There were a lot of guys who had been in the First World War and who still felt young enough to be involved in the Second World War. And they really resented the fact that they were not going to be allowed to be fighting troops. And so, in fact, this gave them a place to be and feel as though they were making some kind of a contribution to the war effort. So that's a recruiting poster for the Veterans Guard of Canada. And that's a group of about maybe 1 platoon there on the property of the prisoner of war camp in Gravenhurst. And they're just right beside the transportation building. There were various and sundry cars and trucks were kept. So not only are you managing the camp and all that stuff, the POWs and all that stuff, and the Veterans Guard and all that stuff, but you've also got a guy who's going to be sort of in loco parentis, we might call it, He's a senior German officer. He's going to be the man who is in charge of what's happening with the POWs. He is a German officer. He's not looking too prepossessing there, is he? You remember that these guys were guys who had been captured in either the African campaign, or they were captured at sea or in the air and whatnot. So I would say he's got a pair of pants that may or may not be uniform. The jacket could or might not be his. The hat appears to be his, but in fact, he's not just looking his very best. He would make sure that there was a POW in charge of each area of the camp, as well as the actual guards who were in charge of each area. And on top of that, he took all the complaints, all the requests, brought them then to the camp commandant. And in very small print, we mentioned he was a member of the escape committee. But not sure. That was probably his favorite role. And that escape committee vetted all of the requests that came from prisoners of war. They would bring forward a plan. I've got a plan for how we're going to escape. I'm going to take 20 men. I want to do this. And they would decide which ones would go forward and which ones wouldn't. In other words, which ones were, and which ones weren't going to get a lot of people in trouble. So there we are on June the 30th, 1940. Can you imagine what Gordon Sloan thought when he walked out of his restaurant on the main street and he stood out there? He'd just been going to get a newspaper, and he's standing in front of his restaurant, and he sees this herd of 476 POWs, some of them in full Nazi uniform, walking down Brock Street towards Bay Street. And he must have done one heck of a double take. I can only imagine him just sort of standing, turning around, going back into the restaurant, and then coming back out again and saying, did I really see that? And he really did. In fact, you can see soldiers walking beside those POWs with guns. Those are young lads who at this particular point still have not gone off to war. And so they are, in fact, the guard for the time being, until we can get the Veterans Guard into place and get them actually standing guard. I do a lot of my talking without actually looking at my notes, and then I have to find them again. So there they are, marching. Whoopsie daisy, wrong way, Corbin. They used various routes to march prisoners of war to camp. The camp, if you know Gravenhurst at all, was at the bottom of Lawrence Street on the water. It's where the Calidore Trail is today, and I'll be talking more about that in a moment. But they were going to be marching them right through the town of Gravenhurst. Can you imagine the people of the town standing on the side of the street, many of them hissing, spitting, you know, screaming probably some, maybe not obscenities in those days, but maybe, because so many people in our town would have had men who were at the front fighting. And here's these guys moving into our town, right? And imagine what they would probably felt fearful. That they were going to have 476 Nazis living in a little village like ours, and that, in fact, they were probably fearful for their children as well. When they got to the end of Lawrence Street, they turned left and went into the prisoner of war camp. Now, this is under construction at this point, so you can only imagine. There's wood laying everywhere, there's rock laying everywhere, there's pieces of buildings and so on. It's quite a mess when they first get there. It didn't take the Royal Canadian Engineers long, along with all the tradespeople, but 186 tradespeople, as I've mentioned, from Gravenhurst, to get the thing whipped into shape. And so, in fact, this 35-acre site on Lake Muskoka has, in fact, this red sort of pentagonal sort of shaped area, which is going to be inhabited by the prisoners of war. You can see that curved building. That's the old Calidore Sanatorium. Now we've got all the rest of that infrastructure around it on 35 acres of land. And you can see all the kinds of things that had to be housed. You had to have a place for the POWs to live. You had to have a place for all of the soldiers who were guarding them, the Veterans Guard, to live. You also had to have guard towers, sentry posts, you name it, you had to have all of that stuff. And by the Geneva Convention of 1929, you had to have an opportunity for all of these POWs to get exercise, to have their minds stimulated as well as their bodies kept in good shape. You didn't have a choice. That was just dictated, period. And you had those other countries like Switzerland breathing down your neck saying, wait a minute, do you have such and such? So there's the camp as it became. And there's what it looked like from the air. Now, Henry Fry took most of these pictures, not related to Cyril Fry, for any of you who know Gravenhurst. Henry Fry was a wonderful photographer from here. In fact, often got the contract to do all kinds of photography for the Toronto Star and so on. He was, in fact, the man who took the picture of the Nazis walking through Gravenhurst on that very first day, the one where, you know, I said there are no pictures going to be taken. Yeah, he took the picture and it appeared on the front page of the Toronto Star the next day. Well, if there was anyone in Ontario who didn't know where it was, but just in case, I guess they didn't name it as being Gravenhurst. That fence that you can see in the water, that's a chain link steel fence that was rooted right down in the rocks in the bottom of the lake. I'm not sure whether diving today would yield you finding anything down there still of the way that that chain link fence was rooted. But there was a time when, after the war, when when people could dive and go down and find, you know, bits and pieces of the place where that fence, it was substantial. That was going to be a swimming area for a way of keeping other swimmers from Muskoka, canoes, boats, and so on from getting too close. You might find a warning shot bow of your canoe. Camp C or Camp Calidore became Camp 20 as various camps in Canada were named and renamed. In October of 1941, it was designated as an officers' camp, and that made a huge difference. Back through all of my. In actual fact, it meant that you were going to have a group of people who were extremely well educated, because they would be the German elite from the German military. So these men were probably well-to-do, first place, had gotten an education in Germany, then had taken up roles as various kinds of captains, lieutenants, commanders, and so on in the German Kriegsmarine, which was the Navy, in the Heer, which was the Army, Luftwaffe, which was the Air Force in Germany. So these men came not only knowing a lot, but being pretty much wedded to the idea of keeping their minds busy while they were in captivity. These were not people who were used to just sitting and doing nothing. They were used to learning constantly in their lives. They were also extremely self-sufficient, and I have highlighted the one word which I think really mattered. I mean, it was all very well that you had landscape artists, farmers, clergy, tailors, electricians, and carpenters among the prisoners of war, but you had chefs. Now, I could take a turnip and probably cook it and mash it and turn it out as something that somebody might be willing to eat, but a chef could take a turnip and do something with it that would be truly spectacular. They had German chefs. So they had their very own chefs. And so they, in fact, generally speaking, ate better than any of the Veterans Guards because they had their own chefs and cooks and so on. We didn't want to take the time to be cooking for them, doing their laundry and all that sort of thing. We had them using their own people who were prisoners of war. So there were mainly officers, and then there was a code of people who were, in fact, lower rank, probably all privates, and they were people who, well, maybe not the chefs, but they were all people who then did things like the laundry and all of that sort of thing, and looked after the food and whatnot. You'd have somebody who was able to cut up the carrots and whatnot. It's not clear from pictures like this, and we have literally probably hundreds of them in the archives, taken by Henry Fry. He was commissioned to do so. He was commissioned to take photographs of 10 prisoners of war at a time. And these would be turned into postcards that could be sent home to Germany to tell people that, in fact, their loved one was alive. Both sides always alerted the other side, or like alerted the allies that, you know, in fact, your son or your daughter is alive, and they are maybe not necessarily where they are, but they're in a prisoner of war camp where they're whatever. So we found that out about our own. They found it out theirs. You can see here, it's pretty difficult to tell whether these guys are from the Kriegsmarine or the Heer or the Luftwaffe, because they're in pieces of uniform. And of course, that's what would happen to you when you were, you know, blowing up in a in a plane shot down or whatever. You would have maybe or maybe not pieces of the uniform. If in fact you were not an officer, or if in fact you didn't have a uniform, you had a camp uniform. And your camp uniform looked like that. Now, it looks very simple. It's a blue shirt with a big red, what they would have called a target on the back. But in actual fact, it wasn't just sewn on the back, because you could just snip that right off and take it off. No, no. A hole was cut out of the back of every shirt, and inside was a red spot like that. Now, that's a lot of sewing, but it gave people work. And in actual fact, it meant that then you couldn't just cut that big red target off and turn it into a normal shirt and start to look like a normal person in the community. Your pants, the same thing. Down the right leg, I'm saying the left, I'm right leg, pointing at my left leg. But anyway, down the outside of one leg and down the inside of the other, material was cut away and a red strip was put up both legs, so that in actual fact, again, you couldn't turn these pants into something that just looked like regular everyday pants. You can see in the picture of those men skating in the prisoner of war camp, actually they're across the Lawrence Street, and you can see a house just up there. That's just a regular house. Somebody was living there at the time. And there are guys skating, and you can see those big red targets on their backs. Now, most of the men that were here were officers. And in actual fact, there was still in play a view of officers that would be very, very different from anything that you and I might share today. But at this time, we were still looking at this whole concept of chivalry and the chivalric idea of an officer is a gentleman's word is his bond. Therefore, it's a syllogism, right? So therefore, an officer, if he gives his word, it's his bond. And you can trust that. Ready for that concept? All right. It was called parole. Not like parole in prison, but parole was the name for this. Under the Geneva Convention, you had to make sure that you were providing as much intellectual and sporting stimulation as you possibly could. Now, that's all very well in Canada when we're not really in the midst of a war. It wouldn't apply. I mean, it was supposed to apply in Germany, but how could you do that in Germany when the country is being bombed and so on, and the men are fighting and whatnot? So in actual fact, what applied in Canada wasn't necessarily applied in Europe. But look at the library. 822 works of German fiction, 1,122 works of German nonfiction. We had music. Where did all of it come from? I'll tell you in a moment. But in fact, we had a dance orchestra, a symphony orchestra, a chamber music orchestra. On Sunday afternoons, the chamber music little group would on the lawn, and the officers would sit and have tea. Their batmen would be serving them tea, and they would be sitting there listening to some little chamber while being served tea and cookies. What went on mostly in this camp for a very long time, despite all the talk about sports and so on, was studying. Of 470 men, officers who were in the camp, 450 of them were enrolled in courses. They wanted to improve their minds. They were people who were used to learning continuously. And so, in fact, some of the people who were in the camp could teach other people courses that they had never taken. So you had people studying such things as philosophy, various languages, theory of music, mathematics, electricity, and how it works, all that kind of thing, motor mechanics. And you had people within the camp who could teach many of these courses. If you didn't, you had men signed up for courses from U of T, prisoners of war, signed up to take courses from U of T. And you had German-speaking professors from U of T who came once a month to make sure that, you know, that you're on track with that you understand what you're learning. I can explain that to you in German if you don't understand it in English. So in actual fact, over here we have who's teaching, and then we've got the courses that they're teaching, and then the schedule. That's what most of the officers were involved in our camp, were learning opportunities to do each day. One of the worst things about being a prisoner of war, apparently, is boredom. They talk about the fact, and many psychologists have examined that whole situation later on, that it was probably the primary impetus for wanting to escape was boredom, nothing to do all day long. So in actual fact, under the Geneva Convention, it was hoped that that would be avoided, and that in fact, these guys would be constantly kept busy doing things. And they were constantly learning, they had sports to play and so on. And they even did some work in Gravenhurst. In actual fact, you can see that's the steps at Gull Lake over there. And they did the steps and the breakwater all along the lake, Gull Lake. Several of the prisoners, the design, he was actually a park designer. And then other people, in fact, did the building of it. And they were happy to get out and do it. I mean, it was something like you could not make an officer work kind of work rules with officers. You could with enlisted men. So in fact, they had to do this only if they wanted to do so, and many of them did. So we still have, the stones are not in exactly the same place now down at Gull Lake that they were in then, but many of them are still the same rocks that held in place there. And there were lots of sports to play: ping pong, tennis, which you could flood in the wintertime, and in the summertime you could play tennis. A sports field for soccer, it's called football, of course, track, all that sort of stuff. They're a bit of a ragtag looking group in their hockey uniforms there, but they had them, and they had skates, and they could play hockey. Or again, another group that was taken by Henry V, but this time two of them are holding little Scotty dogs. And one of them over there on the far side is actually feeding a whole little herd of rabbits. I'm not sure what a herd of rabbits is actually called. I'm not sure what the word for a group, but I think that they just keep constantly multiplying to such an extent that it wouldn't really matter what you called them, because they'd be just morphing into something larger all the time. But in fact, they were allowed to have pets, and I'll tell you again how that came shortly. You can imagine that all of kinds of those rabbits became Hassenpfeffer along the way, since they multiplied as they do. And there was a little line or two that went out about our camp in one of the communiques that went from camp to camp to camp. At one camp, they have a menagerie with a bear cub, 2 monkeys, cats, dogs, bunnies, and a small snake. Imagine that in fact was Gravenhurst they were writing about. It was at this camp here. And there's one of the monkeys that you're looking at there. Notice the spot on his back there on that man. And there's the bear. Where on earth did they get monkeys from? We'll talk about that. So where did all this stuff come from? My goodness. I mean, these guys are officers, but they're prisoners. Well, service pay for officers was still being given to them. So they were still getting about $21 a month. Sounds like so little, but in fact, in those days, it was quite a substantial amount of money. Service pay for other ranks was much, much lower. But in fact, they were not allowed to have money of their own. So the money all went into a central account, and from you could get a chit for use in the camp canteen. And the camp canteen would have had all kinds of things. It would have pop, would have had beer, it would have had perhaps something like chips. I don't know if chips were around then, but cookies and that sort of thing. You could get that. There were also gifts of money from families and gifts from sympathetic Americans. Remember that the Americans did not join the war until substantially later, certainly well after the POW camp was opened. And that, in fact, many Americans were sympathetic to the Germans. And a long time for the Americans to decide which side of the war they were going to come in on. And it was dictated by which side owed them more money. You know, I mean, not only did the Allies owe them money and had borrowed money from the Americans for all kinds of things, but so had the Germans. And which group owed them more money? Turned out probably, for lucky for us, that in fact, I think we owed them more money, so they weren't on our side so that they get that money back and we would win. Notice also the War Prisoners Relief Fund of the YMCA, which was also a way of having all kinds of stuff brought in. If you were in a regular POW camp and you were a regular POW, you could buy certain things in your little canteen. You could get maybe some seasonal fruit, maybe some, I don't know, about a piece of clothing, maybe a book, some soft drinks, some cigarettes, beer added in 1942. I imagine there were a lot of Germans gasping until 1942 because they were used to having beer with, you know, a regular with their meals, as the French would be with wine. Some items were restricted, but generally speaking, you could see that by 1943, in a regular POW camp, and there were 25 of them, you could get a chocolate bar, soft drinks, quart of beer, that kind of thing. I love the one pair of slippers for every 3 POWs. I'm not sure how that worked, but anyway, some items were obviously restricted, and skin lotions being one of them, because depending on what ingredients were in the skin lotion, you might be able to use those for something else. But what was the reality in Camp 20, which was here in Gravenhurst? Well, POW requisitions, in other words, their requests for things, would be approved by their Lagerführer and then would be countersigned by the camp commandant. And it all started out pretty well. I mean, it was pretty reasonable stuff they were asking for. Some German books, a newspaper, some soccer balls, a little more soap, some German Bibles, that kind of thing. Things started to become a little more ambitious as things went on. Some musical instruments, some German books. By 1942, things were becoming a little more ambitious. So that by 1943, officers were using the Eatons and Simpsons catalog to, in fact, order stuff like shoes, soft drinks, tobacco, bars of soap, all kinds of things, clothing and whatnot. A directive came down from the Department of National Defense, which said, curb the orgy of spending at Camp 20, please. The next order that went in actually was higher than the last, so that in fact it became get rid of the catalogs, remove them from all of the buildings and so on, and no more catalogs in camp. So in but monthly income for all those officers, because these were all officers, very different than most POW camps. Officers, hooligans, it added up to lots of money. So that by 1942, they had almost $10,000 in the bank. Now, $10,000 then and $10,000 now are two very different things. $10,000 then would be good enough to buy a house, a farm, you know, that sort of thing. By 1944, even their spending habit, a balance of $23,000, because it all had to go into one account. A POW could only have a chit for a certain item. So they decided that they would, in fact, improve their eating situation by leasing a farm. And there was a farm fairly close to the prisoner of war, the Passmore farm. Many of you who are Gravenhurst people know about the Passmores, a very prominent family here. The Passmore farmhouse had burned down. And so, in fact, there was this farm sitting there, but not actually being used. So they decided with that money that they had in the collective, they could lease a farm. And they did so with the approval of the Canadian government, because you're trying to keep them busy. Busy POWs aren't going to be getting up to mischief. So there it is in 1944, a farm. They had 2 horses there. You can see Caesar and Hannibal, and the dog was Blackie. And that's a lieutenant colonel. Now, a lieutenant colonel normally would not be doing what he's doing in the far bottom corner, which is fine with an old handheld plow. But in actual fact, they were outside. And if they could be outside and could be doing something constructive, they built themselves that little cabin there. They built a barn. And eventually they had all kinds of stuff. They had horses, 3 eventually, a piggery, 28 pigs, and they had 400 hens, 1 for every POW. So in fact, meant eggs, right? And a few sheep as well. They also had a massive garden. And of course, they didn't go at it by halves. Instead of just saying, oh, well, we'll try growing something and see what happens. Oh, no, they studied it. These guys are officers who are used to doing lots of studying. So what did they do? They took samples of soil. I mean, they've got chemists among their group. They took samples of the soil. They read about agricultural techniques in a place like Canada and a place like Muskoka. And then, in fact, they created their first garden. And that was more food for their meals then. And of course, if you've got a chef, think what you could do with that. Even in the spring of 46, when they were going to be going, not home exactly, but going back to Europe, plant the garden, and they, knowing they would never harvest it, but in actual fact, the people of the community got the food, which was in somewhat short supply by then. With all that luxury, would anybody ever want to escape? I mean, they're living a pretty comfy life, right? And they're not under fire. They're away from the war. But in actual fact, they're also away from their families, their wives and their children. And they are teachers and they're officers to boot. And so in actual fact, their place to be is at war. That's what you're going to try to do. So there is not really a written down duty to escape for a POW. In actual fact, it's what they wanted to do if they could. Although studies have been done around the time of the 40s when these guys were around, and later on with both our POWs and with our men who were Germany. And it was discovered that about 20% of POWs either here or there ever really expressed any desire to escape. So in actual fact, good reason for our guys over in Europe. I mean, they couldn't speak other languages other than English. So these guys could speak multiple languages because they were German off. So in fact, many of them spoke English, and although sometimes it would say speaks German, you know, reasonably well. Well, in actual fact, some of them could have written essays for all of us at university and would have done well because they spoke English very well. There was no duty to escape, but in actual fact, many of them would have wanted to escape, even just to cause problems for the people who are guarding them and for the Canadians. The maximum penalty under the Geneva Convention was 28 days in jail. So if you tried to escape and you were caught, maximum penalty for you would be 28 days in jail. I will later on tell you stories of what happened to POWs, our POWs in Germany. Well, let's see. Here are the escapes that we had from this camp. These are all from the Gravenhurst Camp 20. The first one is one of those guys you really, really love in a group. There was actually a plan that had been 40 to dig a tunnel, which had been begun the moment we got prisoners of war into that camp. They had begun digging immediately, and they had plans to take 100 people out through a tunnel. Not easy in Muskoka, taking a tunnel. Yeah. Can you picture with all the rock? Yeah, right. But they're working on it. And says, I don't really care about the rest of you, but I'm going to get out of here. So he takes the tunnel by himself, unauthorized in any way. They catch him, of course, 3 days later, and that takes care of it. It's gone. They just blow up the tunnel. Those are the kinds of guys you on your group, you know. He was caught in Montreal by a very, very smart veterans guard who was at where he was going to be crossing all the bridges that across St. Lawrence there. And he was there and he asked for papers. And of course, this guy didn't have any papers. So he's right back in Buskow, back in Gravenhurst, and he's in jail. There was an escape by vehicle by a guy named Kempe and another guy named Hobbs. Uh, they stuck boards underneath some of the vehicles, two of the vehicles that were in the camp. They were construction vehicles because, as I've said, the camp was under construction for the first whole year that they were there, maybe even more. So in fact, they stuck a board very, very quickly and carefully underneath two different trucks. And then the men crawled in, lay on the board, and then were taken out, of course, with the truck. One of them got to North Bay. He got to North Bay because he was hitchhiking, and a Toronto Star reporter had been driving up the highway and saw this guy hitchhiking, kind of half figured out maybe what he might be looking at because he'd heard that there'd been an escape. So he picked him up and he got the entire story and then took him to the North Bay jail when he got there. The other guy went to Bala and knocked on a door there, let in by someone. And of course, as I said, many could speak English. So he asked for a cup of tea. And the lady there, while calling the police, made him a cup of tea, gave him a sandwich and a couple of cookies. And both of them were back in jail in no time at all for 28 days. Escape by packing case. Gunther Cray had a particular reason for wanting to get home. He'd been married by proxy while he was in a prisoner of war camp. And so, in fact, he'd not even basically seen his bride, and he wanted to get back really badly. So he hid in a packing case that he saw, and then was picked up and carried to the train station, transported by train to Toronto, lifted up the lid of his packing case to see where he was, and they went, aha, gotcha. And so in actual fact, 18 hours of free. My mattress cover was not well thought out. Mattress covers were brown. And so a couple of guys thought, gosh, you know, brown mattress covers would match really well with the terrain around. We'll crawl into a couple of, we'll take them off our, off our beds. We'll wrap them in our towels. And when we go swimming, we will, put them in the water, and then we'll just dive down in, get into the mattress cover. But in actual fact, they weren't outside the prisoner of war camp. That chain link fence right to the bottom. And in actual fact, when they finally came up and went, oh, we're still in here. So that was sort of 3 hours of free and 28 days of jail. This is a great one. The Great Escape by Pillowcase and Sheet. Sheets and pillowcases were white, as they always were. I don't know about you when you were little. I'm a lot older than most of you, but in actual fact, sheets were white, so were pillowcases. So these guys took their sheets and pillowcases into the snow, and they crawled in and rolled them up, and then they sort of, went across the snow. Actually, they got out of the camp because the snow was deep enough that they actually managed to get up over a fence. But in actual fact, 2 were found in a gully very, very close to the camp, maybe within an hour. 1 was found in Washago. 1 was found in Stroud. Now, I have no idea how he ended up over in Stroud. I mean, that seems to be kind of crazy. And 2 were found on a snowplow in Barrie. Now, that might make you think they were inside the cab of the snowplow, but no, in fact, they were on the front of the plow, leaning up against the back of it, hanging on for dear life while they were plowing a road. And they were practically frozen to death by the time they were found. And then there was the other guy who was with those 2 snowplow guys, and they didn't find him. So where was he? There he is. His name was Siegfried Schmidt, and he was still missing. In actual fact, he'd never left. He went up into the attics of one of the buildings, and he was there for 4 months. People were giving him food. He, in fact, did plastic surgery on himself. And when they finally found him, I don't think that he was in very good shape. He had tried to rearrange his features. He had done all kinds of things to his face. And in actual fact, the first trip for him was a hospital and then to another camp. But he was unrecognizable, even by his own men, because he'd been trying to alter his appearance so much. The one that got away completely never really got here. People always say that somebody escaped from Gravenhurst Camp 20, but that's not true. Somebody escaped while trying to come to Gravenhurst Camp 20. He was on a train being brought to where prisoners of war were being collected, and he jumped off the train. He managed, it was winter, so he managed to get across the St. Lawrence and got into New York State. He was protected there. He was given directions as to where he should go for, friendly family and so on and so forth. And he ended up staying there. He stayed in the United States. He married there. He took up a job teaching in a college there. And it wasn't until after the war that he revealed the fact that he had been a German prisoner of war. And he came back to Gravenhurst in 1991 to take a look at what he had missed, basically. But apparently it says there he speaks English, but it doesn't say how fluent he was. In actual fact, he was an extremely accomplished speaker of English and taught in a New York State college. Yeah, we're off on his assessment. By 1944, there was an attempt to categorize prisoners because all these camps spread across Canada from one end to the other, 25 of them, or in some cases 27, where they had actually a combination of POWs and some interned people who were German descent and maybe viewed as being a problem. They attempted to categorize these prisoners so that they could try to put them in places where they couldn't harm each other. Because in actual fact, in Alberta, there had been in one of the prisoner of war camps 2 murders by German hardline Nazis of guys that they decided were not hardline enough. And they killed them. The men who were involved in doing so were eventually tried, convicted, and hanged, because we were still hanging people in those days. So the was to move the black hardliners out of camps where there are these really mild guys who have just been, they were conscripted. They may not have been Nazis at all. They may not have even wanted anything to do with Nazis. They were conscripted Germans. And so in actual fact, they wanted to keep the troublemakers, the frequent flyers in one spot, and then keep the more mild people cutting trees and so on in Northern Ontario. But we didn't have any uprisings or murders in the camp here. The war came to an end at last, but not for prisoners of war from Germany. The war in Europe ended in a series of, as you know, suicides and surrenders and whatnot. And VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, came on the 8th of May, 1945. Gradually, people became aware of the war crimes that had been committed by the Nazis in Europe. And there were many German soldiers here, I think, who probably were shocked to discover what had happened. Soldiers began to come home from Europe. Refugees in Europe were being repatriated to their own. Internees, those are the people that were German speaking in Canada and maybe had been judged or misjudged incorrectly. But the POWs were going to have to wait. They weren't going anywhere until everybody else had been taken back to where they wanted to be. Eventually, the POWs were, in fact, shipped to the UK. But the hardliners were brought together, and they were bringing them from these other camps, and they were bringing them all to Gravenhurst. So we got all the hardliners here, and our camp was designated a black camp. More moderate POWs were sent back to England for a while to do reconstruction work, and gradually the POW camps were closed down. 6,000 POWs asked to stay in Canada and live here, and they were all refused. They could go home, they could go back to Germany, which eventually they would get to, and they could apply, but not till about 1953. So that's quite a while after the end of the war. And they could apply to come to Canada, and many did. Camp 20 in Gravenhurst would close one day shy of 6 years after it opened. So what was the legacy of Camp 20? Well, pretty neat in some ways. See that property that looks pretty familiar? You still see the chain link fence in the water down there. You still see that building up there? Well, that actually underwent $100,000 in those days, a lot of money. We're talking millions now. All kinds of refurbishment by three Toronto businessmen who were Jewish. And when they had finally gotten where they wanted it, they opened it as the Gateway Hotel. And it became a hotel for Jewish vacationers. Because in Muskoka, we had many resorts that would not take Jewish vacationers. There were lots of that said Gentiles only. That was everywhere. That was all over North America. So in actual fact, this is going to become top level, really fantastic resort that was going to be owned by and operated for Jewish vacation. Take anybody who wanted to come and stay there. So in actual fact, they refurbished the whole place. And there are what would look like a group of Nazi prisoners of war playing tennis or whatever down there. Now that's some Jewish vacationers playing volleyball, the very same spot. And it was a luxury resort for everybody. A couple of young guys who were just starting out in show business. One of them was Mo Kaufman, one of my favorite jazz flautists. And the other one, a comedian named, and they both got their start in this resort here. It was the place to be. They had an orchestra second to none, and there were people coming from all over. So in actual fact, although some of the resorts said no vacationers, in fact, they weren't too proud to come and go to a Jewish resort because they got to be entertained by these wonderful entertainment and bands and so on that came there. They didn't turn away anyone, including former P.O.W. The actual wives and children of former POWs came to see where their husbands had spent 3, 4, 5, 6 years. And in actual fact, people like Archie Moore trained there. You know, it was wonderful for a while, but eventually Jewish people didn't want to be restricted to a vacation resort that said, this is a great Jewish vacation resort. I mean, they should be able to go anywhere and spend their vacation anywhere they wanted. So it wasn't going to last for long, but through to about 1960 or 61, it was the place to be. There's that good old Muskoka granite that somebody was going to have to try to tunnel through at some point earlier on. Can't you just picture it? But that in actual fact is just the edge of the prisoner of war camp. There's a subdivision that now exists on the 35 acres. But Youngerman, who was one of the 3 Jewish businessmen who had bought that for a Jewish resort, in actual fact, sold that land to a neighborhood, new homes, but he gave Graven the strip along the lake. So in actual fact, we got this incredible piece of land from him that went right along Muskoka. Still have it today. And it's called the Calidor Trail now. Just in the last 2 years, we've done something that should have been done a long time ago. And we have in fact created a trail along the shore of Muskoka Bay that in fact has a way for people to relive what went on this property and be right beside the water. And the whole trail runs right along this. So in fact, all the way on the trail, there are interpretive panels. And so you can walk that little trail and read about what was there in that spot or what was there and so on. And that was all done with the Gravenhurst archives. the town of Gravenhurst and the Municipal Heritage Committee of Gravenhurst undertook that whole operation. That's the view you get on one side as you're walking that trail. It's a lovely trail to walk. Might be a little warm in 35-degree weather, but in fact, you can walk by where all the kids swim. They jump off the rocks out there and swim in the bay. My daughter used to say to me, I'm going swimming. And I'm going, where are you going? Oh, to the rocks. Yeah, right. That big cliff there, that's where they went swimming. Anyway, that's what it looks like today. And I will be happy to take any questions that you might have. It's warm, I know. Yes, ma'am. Wouldn't it be nice to think so? In actual fact, what was supposed to happen was we were supposed to pay those officers at the rate of pay that were being paid in Germany. And Germany was supposed to be paying our guys over there at that rate of pay. And it kind of worked for a little while, but not for a long while. Eventually we stopped. The German government was supposed to be paying all the